The most intellectually disturbing cosmic horror monsters begins with a question for you. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you right now? This video explores why certain cosmic horror monsters stay in our minds long after their stories end. They do not rely on violence or loud terror. Instead, they disturb us by changing how we think about knowledge, time, reality, and our place in the universe. In the early 20th century, writers began to imagine a universe far bigger and colder than anyone wanted to believe. From that fear came beings that were not just creatures, but ideas. Each one represents a crack in human certainty about memory, identity, space, even destiny itself. They force us to face a simple but terrifying possibility. What if understanding the truth makes us smaller, not stronger? And here's the twist. These monsters may not be frightening because they exist in stories. They are frightening because the questions they raise are still unanswered. The more we learn about the cosmos today, the more their shadows seem to grow. As you keep watching, you may notice something unsettling. The moment you try to understand these beings, you step into their world. Curiosity becomes a door, and once opened, it does not close easily. So let's move forward and meet the creations that reshaped modern horror, not just to see what they are, but to understand why they still challenge how we see ourselves. The first generations of cosmic horror creators worked at a moment when human confidence cracked under new knowledge. Between 1850 and 1930, astronomy revealed a universe far larger than the one earlier thinkers had imagined. At the same time, evolutionary theory disrupted any hope that humanity occupied a privileged position. Writers who sensed these shifts saw an opportunity. They could build monsters that expressed the emotional cost of scientific expansion. The result was a form of horror defined less by violence and more by intellectual pressure. Consider this carefully because it explains why these creations still unsettle readers accustomed to modern explanations. The early 20th century was marked by a curious tension. Technological progress promised mastery, yet every major discovery widened the unknown. When Edwin Hubble confirmed in 1925 that the universe extended beyond the Milky Way, it forced even casual readers to confront a scale that defied intuition. Literature followed this revelation, developing creatures whose power rested not in domination, but in sheer incomprehensibility. These beings represented an indifferent cosmos, one that had no interest in human concerns. Their creators understood that fear intensifies when the threat is conceptual rather than physical, because an idea cannot be outrun. Writers of this period drew heavily on scholarly voices to frame their creations. Many of them adopted tones reminiscent of anthropology, archaeology, or early psychology. They used academic language not for accuracy, but to create the illusion that their monsters belonged to documented history. This decision strengthened the material by placing invented entities inside recognizable institutions. It also reflected a growing cultural belief that knowledge itself was unstable. When a narrator presented a monstrous account through notes, fragments, or translations, the form suggested that truth can be discovered, yet still remain beyond interpretation. The creators approached monster design through subtraction rather than addition. Instead of giving readers a precise image, they highlighted gaps, distorted geometry, impossible angles, or movements that contradicted natural law. These choices mirror the intellectual climate of a world grappling with quantum theory, which by 1927 had already challenged classical certainty. The monsters served as metaphors for these unresolved debates. When a story mentioned a shape that refused to hold still in memory, it echoed the era's confusion over what reality was made of. The technique signaled that horror emerges most effectively when explanation fails at the threshold of new knowledge. The first wave of cosmic horror also used mythic structures to increase authenticity. Writers blended Sumerian fragments, Greek echoes, and medieval grimoires into new genealogies for their creatures. This layering created the impression that the entities existed long before human storytelling. It also made readers complicit in the search for meaning, because deciphering the references felt like uncovering a buried lineage. A triadic pattern emerges in many texts: ancient origins, partial rediscovery, sudden revelation. This structure traces humanity's shifting relationship with the unknown, moving from confident ignorance to reluctant comprehension. By positioning monsters as remnants of forgotten epochs, the stories raised an unsettling question. What if humanity is simply late to a world already occupied? The idea resonated with archaeological discoveries of the period, including the 1922 excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb, which drew global attention to lost civilizations. Cosmic horror absorbed this energy and redirected it towards speculative antiquity. Its monsters became symbols of deep time, beings whose existence implied cycles of rise and collapse far exceeding recorded history. The comparison to ancient ruins clarifies their narrative function. They remind readers that human culture is a brief event, not the defining feature of the planet. The intent behind these creatures was rarely malicious in the moral sense. Their creators sought to explore what happens when the human mind encounters something that does not recognize it. This is why many monsters remain asleep, trapped, or indifferent. Their threat arises from scale and nature, not choice. The distinction matters. It transforms horror from a struggle between adversaries into an encounter between incompatible realities. Not fear of attack, but fear of irrelevance. This shift marks the transition from Gothic dread to cosmic dread, where terror is existential rather than moral. Taken together, the historical forces behind these creations formed a perfect storm: scientific disruption, rapid cultural change, and a literary environment ready to break with tradition. The monsters born from this moment reflect a world learning, reluctantly, that certainty is temporary. They embody a universe that does not answer questions, even when pressed. As we move to the next subsection, we will examine the cultural and philosophical influences that shaped these beings further, tracing how older myths and intellectual traditions prepared the ground for their emergence. The cultural roots of cosmic horror stretch far beyond the 20th century. Although the form appears modern, it draws energy from earlier traditions that questioned humanity's place in the world. Ancient cosmologies frequently depicted creation as an unstable conflict between order and chaos. Myths from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and early Greece imagined primordial beings whose existence preceded structure. These figures, Apep circling the sunbark, Tiamat dissolving into the substance of the world, introduced a pattern in which the universe begins with forces too vast for humans to comprehend. Cosmic horror inherits this idea, transforming it into narratives where the unknown has simply waited for us to notice it. Philosophical ancestry also plays a crucial role. Gnostic texts from the 1st century CE propose that the world was shaped by an imperfect creator, operating below a higher, unknowable reality. This concept undermined the belief that existence followed a coherent plan. Modern writers recognize the implications. If the universe was built by something indifferent or flawed, then human understanding would always remain partial. The echo of this idea appears in many cosmic horror stories, where characters encounter vast structures or intelligences that dwarf their explanatory tools. The influence is indirect, yet unmistakable in the way these tales treat knowledge as both revelation and destabilization. Medieval mysticism supplied another foundation. Christian and Islamic thinkers sometimes described divine encounters as overwhelming floods of perception that exceeded the mind's capacity. Although these accounts framed the experience as holy, they imply a recognizable pattern. Contact with the absolute destroys familiar categories. Cosmic horror adopts the structure, but removes the comfort of divinity. When a character glimpses a being too large or too complex, the result resembles negative theology turned inside out. Instead of approaching an incomprehensible God, the protagonist confronts an incomprehensible universe, and the absence of meaning becomes the source of dread. The Enlightenment period added an unexpected influence. Philosophers such as Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant defined the sublime as the moment when the mind meets something too powerful to grasp, yet cannot look away from. This aesthetic category encouraged writers to explore experiences where awe and terror merge. Cosmic horror expands this framework by applying it to scientific discovery. A mountain range may simplify the sublime, but a galaxy viewed through a telescope raises questions about scale that no landscape can match. The transition from natural to cosmic sublimity marks a turning point. It replaces the fear of nature with the fear of infinite context. 19th century literature sharpened these themes by pairing them with emerging scientific anxieties. When Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, it altered more than biology. It shifted how humans imagined themselves. Evolution suggested contingency rather than destiny. Writers such as Algernon Blackwood and Arthur Machen translated this shift into stories where the boundaries of human identity blur. Their work reveals a triad of concerns that cosmic horror would later refine: the instability of the self, the fragility of perception, and the vastness of time. These ideas prepared readers for monsters that were not threats to the body, but threats to the idea of humanity itself. A comparison to Gothic fiction clarifies the transformation. Gothic tales often focus on transgression, cursed families, forbidden rooms, or moral corruption. In contrast, cosmic horror centers on epistemology. The reader is not asked to fear guilt, but ignorance. This distinction matters because it explains why the monsters in cosmic horror rarely behave like antagonists. They represent structures, scales, or principles rather than intentions. Gothic villains operate within human logic. Cosmic entities do not. Not corruption, but irrelevance becomes the core fear. This shift reflects a broader cultural transition from moral certainty to scientific uncertainty. Modern anthropology also shaped the genre's development. As Western scholars in the late 19th century documented cultures with unfamiliar cosmologies, they introduced to popular readers a wider range of mythic imagination. Writers used this research, sometimes carelessly, sometimes creatively, to build fictional traditions that felt ancient. The method served two purposes. First, it made invented creatures appear rooted in global history. Second, it highlighted the limits of Western knowledge. When a monster emerged from a culture supposedly forgotten or misunderstood, it reinforced the idea that humanity's records are incomplete. This strategy also anticipated later academic debates about cultural bias, which cosmic horror often dramatizes through unreliable interpreters. By the early 20th century, these influences converged. Scientific discovery, philosophical pessimism, and global mythic traditions all pointed toward the same unsettling conclusion. The universe might not be organized around humans. Writers sensed that this idea could fuel a new type of horror. Instead of describing the dark corners of human psychology, they described the dark margins of cosmic structure. This approach changed the emotional texture of fear. Dread became contemplative. The terror of punishment transformed into the terror of comprehension. And readers encountered creatures who did not hate humanity. They simply exceeded it. These antecedents explain why cosmic horror feels simultaneously ancient and modern. Its monsters echo primordial chaos, medieval mysticism, Enlightenment sublimity, and Darwinian uncertainty. They embody tensions that cultures have wrestled with for centuries, but articulate them through contemporary frameworks. As we move to the next subsection, the language behind these beings, their names, symbols, and impossible descriptions, will reveal how writers used etymology itself as a tool for unease. Writers of cosmic horror understood early that language itself could become a site of unease. They approached naming with deliberate strangeness, treating each word as a threshold between familiar speech and something older. Many of the genre's most memorable entities carry names that resist smooth pronunciation. This difficulty is not accidental. It signals that the creature belongs to structures where human phonetics falter. When readers stumble, the story gains power. The name becomes an encounter rather than a label. Consider the effect of a consonant cluster that seems to grind against the mouth. It makes the creature feel linguistically displaced, as if the word gestured toward vocal organs humanity never possessed. Etymology in cosmic horror often functions through imitation rather than derivation. A name may suggest ancient roots without belonging to any documented language. This impression evokes the presence of earlier civilizations, now vanished, whose vocabulary reflected different cognitive frameworks. Writers usually achieve this through subtle borrowing. A syllable might echo Akkadian or Greek without forming a traceable lineage. The strategy creates a balance between recognition and alienation. The reader senses antiquity but cannot parse it. Not randomness, but calculated ambiguity produces this effect. It positions the fictional world within a vast linguistic landscape that dwarfs recorded history. Symbolic language broadens the method beyond names. Characters often describe monsters using geometric or architectural references, because geometry can communicate strangeness without relying on direct depiction. When a narrator notes that an angle feels wrong, the implication is not merely spatial confusion. It suggests that the creature embodies a different set of physical principles. The use of geometry as metaphor reflects the early 20th century's engagement with non-Euclidean mathematics, which entered public discussion after 1900 with the popularization of Riemann's work. Writers recognized that mathematical language could convey conceptual disruption more effectively than ornate description. Color appears frequently as another symbolic device. In stories like The Color Out of Space, the hue becomes a linguistic anomaly. It is said to be a color, yet not one known to human perception. This contradiction communicates more than visual distortion. It hints at a world whose wavelengths exceed biological limits. The choice demonstrates a broader pattern in cosmic horror. Language strains against the boundaries of the describable. When terms break at the edges of experience, readers feel the tension between human understanding and cosmic reality. A triad often emerges in such passages: color, movement, and form, each destabilized in a way that implies the creature belongs to a realm adjacent to ours. Writers also rely on textual artifacts to enrich their symbolic systems. Invented books, tablets, or inscriptions become linguistic anchors for the mythos. Their content is rarely quoted directly. Instead, fragments or paraphrases appear, creating the illusion of suppressed knowledge. This technique mirrors real archaeological practice of the late 19th century, when incomplete translations of ancient texts captured public imagination. The fictional artifacts operate similarly. They imply that the monster's nature has been repeatedly encountered and poorly understood across centuries. The language surrounding these artifacts tends to imitate scholarly caution, emphasizing uncertainty rather than revelation. Sound plays a distinct role in the symbolic lexicon. Many monsters are associated with vibrations, hums, or rhythms that do not resemble normal speech. These auditory signatures imply communication beyond verbal language. They also gesture toward physical processes, oscillation, resonance, decay, that align the monster with natural forces rather than personalities. The effect is subtle, but significant. It distances the creature from anthropomorphic intention and connects it to cosmological patterns. In several works, the sound persists after the creature vanishes, suggesting influence without presence. That persistence turns language into residue, marking the edges of contact. Some writers experiment with the absence of language. When a narrator admits an inability to describe a creature, the admission becomes part of the horror. Readers must imagine a void where words fail. This gesture resembles apophatic theology, which attempts to describe the divine through negation. Here, however, the approach emphasizes limitation rather than reverence. What remains unsaid becomes more haunting than any explicit image. The technique depends on precision. The narrator must demonstrate competence before confessing failure. The gap between knowledge and expression becomes the emotional core of the passage. These linguistic strategies create an ecosystem of meaning that extends beyond the creatures themselves. Every distorted name, every geometric reference, every broken description positions the monster as a force that challenges human frameworks. Language becomes both tool and battleground. When readers confront a word that refuses easy meaning, they experience the genre's central theme, the mind encountering something it cannot fully contain. This linguistic struggle deepens the narrative, transforming monsters from fictional constructs into philosophical provocations. Understanding these symbolic choices clarifies why cosmic horror maintains its effect even when readers know the plot. The power resides not in surprise, but in the sustained tension between language and the unknown. As we move into the next subsection, we will see how writers expanded this tension into broader myth-building techniques, creating worlds that feel historically layered, interconnected, and disturbingly authentic. Writers of cosmic horror recognized early that a monster's impact increases when it appears to emerge from a broader historical framework. They did not simply invent creatures. They built structures that suggested centuries of forgotten encounters. This technique, myth-building through layered documentation, created the impression that the fictional world extended far beyond the immediate story. Readers sensed depth even when details were sparse. Consider this carefully because the effect depends on a balance between revelation and restraint. Too much detail would collapse the illusion. Too little would feel arbitrary. These creators mastered the space between. One common method involved weaving real locations and fabricated histories together. When a narrative mentions a recognizable port, university, or archaeological site, readers accept the setting as plausible. Into that plausible environment, Writers introduced references to vanished cults, incomplete excavations, or suppressed manuscripts. The invented material appeared credible because it borrowed the texture of genuine scholarship. This strategy reflects the cultural climate of the 1890 to 1930 period, when discoveries in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Mesoamerica regularly reached newspapers. Fiction borrowed that energy. The monsters seemed connected to the same global process of unearthing long-buried structures. Fragmentation became an essential stylistic device. Many cosmic horror stories rely on diaries, letters, newspaper clippings, and translated tablets to build their narrative foundations. Each fragment contributes a specific function. It signals that the truth has been encountered repeatedly, but never fully understood. This structure also mirrors emerging academic disciplines: anthropology, comparative religion, early linguistics, that often presented knowledge through pieced-together evidence. The stories mimic this practice, not to imitate scholarship exactly, but to evoke the intellectual excitement and uncertainty of reconstructing a past that resists clarity. A notable triadic pattern appears across this genre: discovery, misinterpretation, and belated recognition. First, a physical artifact or unusual event sparks curiosity. Second, the characters attempt to explain it through the lens of familiar knowledge. Third, the deeper significance emerges too late for meaningful action. This structure reflects a broader philosophical idea. The human mind defaults to interpretation, even when the available data cannot support understanding. Not ignorance, but misplaced certainty becomes the real danger. The pattern reinforces the sense that cosmic entities operate on scales incompatible with human reasoning. Writers also amplified authenticity through intertextual cross-referencing. A fictional grimoire might appear briefly in one story and reappear in another as a footnote, rumor, or academic curiosity. This repetition creates the sense of a shared archive. It mirrors how real-world mythologies function, accumulating meaning through continual reinterpretation. The method was particularly effective because the stories were often spread across different publications, giving readers the impression that the world itself was pointing to these artifacts. The cross-references served as connective tissue, subtly implying that the monsters belonged to a larger cosmological system. Geological deep time played a distinct role in myth-building. Influenced by Charles Lyell's geological work and later scientific advances, writers positioned their creatures not as intruders, but as remnants. They imagined epochs long before humans existed, where civilizations rose, collapsed, and vanished into sediment layers. References to fossilized ruins, submerged cities, or anomalous strata supported this vision. The monsters became survivors of earlier worlds, not predators of the present. This approach shifted the emotional tone of horror. The reader confronts not attack, but endurance. What terrifies is the suggestion that humanity is a temporary overlay on a planet with far older tenets. Invented rituals and belief systems provided an additional layer of authenticity. These were usually described with restraint: gestures, chants, calendars, rather than full theological frameworks. The limited detail prevents the world from feeling over-explained, yet it hints at a complex tradition behind the fragment. The technique parallels anthropological field notes of the early 20th century, which often included partial observations from unfamiliar cultures. Fiction adapted this method to imply that human societies across time responded to cosmic entities without ever truly understanding them. The ritual becomes a distorted memory, passed through generations yet never decoded. The illusion of authenticity depends heavily on narrative tone. Many stories rely on skeptical narrators who insist that their accounts should not be believed. This paradox strengthens credibility. When a narrator claims reluctance, readers interpret it as honesty. The device echoes scientific caution, where conclusions are framed tentatively. By adopting this voice, writers encourage readers to suspend disbelief. The narrator becomes both witness and warning, guiding the audience through a world where truth exists but remains fundamentally inaccessible. The tension between knowing and refusing to know defines much of the genre's emotional impact. Myth-building in cosmic horror succeeds because it does not aim to create a closed system. Instead, it constructs a network of hints, inconsistencies, and suggestive fragments. The result feels more authentic than a fully mapped mythology. Real cultures produce conflicting documents, disputed translations, and missing records. Cosmic horror mimics this unevenness. The gaps become productive spaces where implication works more effectively than exposition. Readers fill these spaces with speculation, which deepens engagement while preserving the monster's essential mystery. These narrative techniques shape the experience of encountering the genre. Creatures do not appear as isolated inventions, but as components of a long, unstable archive. The stories behave as if they are rediscovering rather than inventing. That illusion draws readers into a shared intellectual search, one that never reaches certainty, yet never stops accumulating meaning. As we move into the next part, the philosophical nature of these beings will become clearer, revealing how themes of insignificance, entropy, and collapsing perception emerge from the very structures these myths establish. Cosmic horror rests on several philosophical ideas that undermine the frameworks through which people normally interpret the universe. The most influential of these is insignificance. Writers in the early 20th century worked in a cultural moment shaped by new astronomical observations. When scholars such as Vesto Slipher, 1912, recorded the redshifts of distant galaxies, it became clear that humanity occupied no meaningful center. Literature responded by depicting creatures whose existence rendered human concerns microscopic. These monsters do not frighten through physical danger alone. They unsettle because they reveal the scale of structures that operate without reference to human values. The result is a narrative environment where the self appears not threatened, but overshadowed. A second theme involves entropy, which entered cultural conversation through the popularization of thermodynamics in the late 19th century. Entropy suggested a universe moving toward increasing disorder, indifferent to human hopes. Cosmic horror adapted this idea by presenting environments where decay felt inevitable, not accidental. Stories often describe landscapes eroding under forces that refuse interpretation, glaciers shifting with unnatural rhythm, abandoned cities consumed by strange growth. These images reflect an underlying philosophical position. The universe trends toward dissolution, and life persists only temporarily within that trajectory. The concept deepens narrative tension by shifting fear from individual loss to cosmic eventuality. Dream and waking states form another central concept. Writers frequently use dreams as entry points into ontological instability. Dreams allow narrative access to dimensions that defy physical laws, creating a laboratory of sorts for exploring altered perception. In many works, the boundary between dreaming and reality becomes uncertain. Consider the fictional line often quoted in later analyses. The mind waking finds itself smaller than the dream it fled. The statement encapsulates a recurring pattern. Dreams are not escapes, but intrusions. They reveal information the waking mind cannot contain. The technique reflects early psychological debates following Freud's 1900 publication on dream interpretation. Yet cosmic horror reverses the premise. Instead of dreams expressing hidden human desires, they expose the presence of non-human forces. Temporal distortion functions as a related, philosophical concern. Many cosmic horror narratives break linear time, presenting moments where characters perceive centuries unfolding inside seconds. This distortion communicates more than narrative style. It suggests that time, as humans understand it, is a local convention rather than a universal constant. Entities like the great race of Yith often manipulate consciousness across eras, implying that identity itself is not anchored. Stories relying on temporal instability carry an implicit question. If time is flexible, what becomes of causality? The question matters because it challenges the foundation of human rationality, which depends on sequence to organize thought. The collapse of epistemic certainty builds directly from these themes. Characters often encounter evidence that contradicts their understanding of the world, yet they cannot reject it. The tension between experience and explanation becomes the engine of fear. When a narrator describes a creature using both mathematical language and emotional unease, the combination signals that knowledge has reached its limit. A triadic structure frequently emerges: observation, hypothesis, failure. The narrator sees something, attempts to explain it, and finds that the explanation dissolves. The pattern dramatizes a philosophical position found in several late 19th century thinkers. Reality exceeds the models designed to describe it. Cosmic horror often pairs these philosophical ideas with the concept of inevitability. Unlike traditional monsters, many cosmic entities cannot be defeated because they do not oppose humanity. They exist on trajectories that intersect briefly with human life before continuing undisturbed. This indifference is central to their thematic function. Not malice, but incompatibility defines them. A line from a fictional scholar in one well-known story captures the idea: the universe is not hostile, yet it destroys us by simply existing. The statement echoes a sentiment found in early expressions of existential philosophy, where the world's lack of inherent meaning forces individuals to confront uncomfortable truths. These philosophical foundations produce a distinctive emotional texture. Readers experience fear not through anticipation of violence, but through recognition of conceptual instability. The terror arises when familiar categories fail. Time, identity, causality, and perception collapse under pressures they were never designed to withstand. The monsters serve as catalysts for this breakdown, but the breakdown itself is the central theme. This structure helps explain why cosmic horror continues to resonate. It addresses questions that remain unsolved in scientific and philosophical discourse, transforming them into narrative form without pretending to resolve them. Taken together, insignificance, entropy, dream instability, temporal distortion, and epistemic collapse form the intellectual core of cosmic horror. They shift attention from human struggle to cosmic structure, reframing fear as a philosophical experience. As we move to the next subsection, we will see how these ideas become embodied in the entities themselves. Creatures designed not simply to terrify, but to illuminate the fragile frameworks upon which human understanding depends. The entities that inhabit cosmic horror emerge from a philosophical need, rather than a biological one. They are designed to embody forces that destabilize human assumptions about time, perception, and meaning. This explains why many of them appear in forms that contradict natural categories. Their existence depends on conceptual tension. They are not versions of animals, spirits, or deities. They represent structural truths the human mind was not built to hold. Writers understood that the most effective monsters operate as ideas as much as organisms, and they shape their creations accordingly. One of the most influential figures is the entity often described as a chaotic nucleus of existence. Its defining characteristic is not appearance, but absence of intention. It acts because it is. The fictional line, "The idiot pulse at the center of infinity," captures the essence, a presence too fundamental to possess purpose. This being symbolizes the fear that the universe lacks guidance. Its creation reflects early 20th century discussions of randomness in physics, especially after 1905, when theories of atomic motion began entering public discourse. Readers recognized the unsettling implication. If existence arises from chance, then entities representing that chance would resist any moral or narrative framework. Another central figure embodies total knowledge, an intelligence occupying every point in time and space. Stories describe it as a gate, a key, and a guardian simultaneously. This triadic formulation suggests that understanding and transcendence collapse into a single phenomenon. The entity functions as a metaphor for omniscience, stripped of benevolence. It represents the idea that knowledge without limitation dissolves identity. Characters who encounter it rarely confront a body, they confront a principle. The philosophical weight of this figure aligns with debates about determinism during the 1910 to 1930 period, when scientific thinkers speculated whether perfect knowledge of physical laws could predict all events. Cosmic horror transformed that speculation into a being whose awareness renders individuality meaningless. Dream-dwelling entities serve a different purpose. They demonstrate that consciousness is permeable. The most recognizable among them remains dormant yet influential, shaping human imagination through dreams rather than direct contact. Narratives frequently describe this being as sleeping beneath the waves, yet communicating through the minds of those who can hear. This concept draws from the growing public fascination with subconscious processes after the rise of psychoanalytic theory. Instead of dreams expressing internal conflict, these stories treat dreams as channels for external forces. The entity becomes a symbol of intrusion, an intelligence reaching across dimensions without leaving its resting place. The messenger figure stands apart from these vast presences because it interacts directly with human characters. Often portrayed with fluid form and shifting roles, it can appear as a scientist, a prophet, or a wanderer. Its defining trait is intentional communication. Unlike other cosmic beings, it seems to take interest in humanity, though the motivation remains opaque. The result is deeply unsettling. The messenger collapses the distance between cosmic scale and human experience. It speaks, travels, and manipulates events, yet its loyalties remain unknowable. This ambiguity aligns with philosophical discussions of agency, where actions occur without stable intention. The messenger embodies this instability, making it one of the most intellectually disturbing figures in the genre. Other entities represent evolutionary thought taken to its extreme. The so-called elder things are often portrayed as scientists of a pre-human era, creatures whose organic structure reflects neither plant nor animal. Their existence indicates that intelligence may arise from principles unrelated to human biology. The stories describe how they engineered subordinate forms, only to be overthrown by their own creations. This narrative mirrors early 20th century anxieties about uncontrolled technology and the limits of scientific authority. More importantly, it reframes humanity as a later, possibly irrelevant development. These beings illustrate a philosophical reversal. Intelligence does not culminate in humanity. Humanity is one example within a broader evolutionary field. Entities capable of transferring consciousness across time further complicate identity. The Great Race, as it is often called, represents a civilization that uses intellect to escape extinction by moving from body to body through deep epochs. The concept raises a profound question. If consciousness can detach from biology and chronology, what defines a self? A fictional line attributed to their scholars claims, "Memory is the only homeland." That phrase encapsulates the entity's thematic function. It suggests that identity relies on continuity of thought rather than continuity of form. This idea intersects with philosophical debates about personal identity found in early analytic philosophy, yet cosmic horror approaches it through destabilization rather than analysis. Even smaller entities, those that appear briefly or with limited description, reflect specific philosophical tensions. Shapeless masses that absorb matter illustrate entropy. Whispering presences in deserted landscapes illustrate non-locality. Creatures composed of vapor or magnetism illustrate the breakdown of material categories. Each one embodies a principle rather than a motive. Their variety reinforces a core idea. The universe contains forms of existence that do not correspond to human frameworks. Not antagonists, but expressions of structure become the true monsters of cosmic horror. Together, these beings create a conceptual constellation. They express randomness, omniscience, intrusion, instability, evolution, temporality, and dissolution. Their power lies in representing conditions rather than personalities. As we move to the next subsection, the human response to these conditions, particularly the breakdown of perception and sanity, will reveal how cosmic horror uses interaction, not confrontation, to produce its most enduring effects. Human interaction with cosmic entities rarely resembles confrontation. It resembles contact between incompatible systems. The human mind evolved to navigate local environments, predictable seasons, stable geometry, and manageable scales of time. When stories place characters before forces that exceed these limits, the result is not simple fear, but cognitive fracture. Madness in cosmic horror is not a medical condition. It is the narrative sign of epistemic overload. Characters encounter structures their minds cannot integrate, and the collapse is presented as the rational outcome of an impossible demand. Early writers understood that intellectual curiosity creates the most direct path toward this collapse. Their protagonists tend to be scholars, surveyors, scientists, or archivists, individuals trained to trust evidence. When such characters gather fragments pointing toward non-human activity, their training becomes a liability. They cannot dismiss anomalies, they catalog them. A fictional line often cited in commentary captures this dynamic. The more he understood, the less he believed his own understanding. The paradox demonstrates how knowledge becomes corrosive under conditions where explanation breaks down. Curiosity leads not toward mastery, but toward destabilization. Madness emerges, gradually, usually beginning with sensory ambiguity. Characters describe hearing faint rhythms or encountering shapes that refuse stable outline. These early intrusions undermine the reliability of perception. The effect mirrors philosophical debates from the early 20th century, when discussions of relativity and quantum mechanics cast doubt on the stability of observation. Cosmic horror dramatizes this uncertainty through narrative technique. The more the character observes, the less coherent the world becomes. The first crack appears when sensory data contradicts familiar physical laws, yet the character cannot ignore them. Dreams serve as another form of interaction. Entities often communicate indirectly, sending impressions or symbols rather than language. Dreams bypass conscious judgment, allowing intrusion without resistance. When a character wakes carrying knowledge they could not have acquired, the story highlights the vulnerability of cognition. The mind becomes permeable, and the dream becomes a channel rather than an illusion. This technique also reveals a deeper theme. Madness arises not from internal instability, but from external pressure. The dream experience destabilizes identity because it blurs the distinction between self-generated thought and imposed vision. Some interactions occur through cults or communities shaped by prolonged exposure. These groups often reinterpret the entity through ritual, myth, or prophecy, creating meaning where none exists. Their behavior illustrates another philosophical point. Humans instinctively structure the unknown, even when the structure distorts reality. The cult functions as a coping mechanism, offering certainty in the face of overwhelming ambiguity. For outsiders who investigate these groups, the contrast between coherent ritual and incoherent cosmic truth becomes a source of psychological tension. It shows how madness can manifest collectively, not just individually. Language begins to deteriorate as interaction deepens. Characters lose the ability to articulate their experiences, reporting that words fail or that familiar concepts unravel. This linguistic breakdown is not theatrical. It reflects the philosophical core of the genre. If the universe contains structures that language cannot describe, then speech collapses when confronting them. The failure of language signals the failure of cognition itself. A triadic progression often appears. Perception falters, language falters, identity falters. Once a character cannot describe what they have seen, they can no longer situate themselves within a coherent worldview. In many stories, madness becomes a protective mechanism. Characters who fully comprehend the entity rarely survive in a meaningful sense. Those who misinterpret the experience may endure, though they live within a distorted understanding. Cosmic horror therefore frames madness as both symptom and defense. It shields the mind from truths it cannot integrate. A line from a fictional memorandum illustrates this. His mind broke along the line of least resistance. The phrase suggests that insanity is not random. It is the path the mind chooses to preserve something of itself when overwhelmed by incompatible information. The collapse of reason also disrupts temporal perception. Characters report that time stretches, contracts, or loops. This distortion reinforces the philosophical idea that human cognition depends on linear sequence. When that sequence fails, identity disintegrates. The character becomes unmoored, caught between moments that no longer align. Such scenes echo psychological accounts of trauma, yet extend beyond them. They imply not emotional disturbance, but metaphysical disorientation. The entity does not attack. It shifts the conditions under which thought occurs. Ultimately, human interaction in cosmic horror reveals the fragility of the cognitive structures that support everyday life. Madness is not portrayed as moral failing or supernatural curse. It is the logical result of attempting to interpret phenomena outside the boundaries of human comprehension. Not weakness, but incompatibility becomes the driving force of collapse. As we move into the next subsection, we will examine how forbidden knowledge, texts, artifacts, and revelations accelerates this collapse by exposing characters to truths that destabilize the very possibility of stable understanding. Forbidden knowledge in cosmic horror is rarely dangerous because of what it reveals. It is dangerous because it cannot be integrated into the structures that make human reasoning possible. Texts, tablets, specimens, and inscriptions function as catalysts for epistemic collapse. They expose characters to information that exceeds their interpretive frameworks, forcing the mind to choose between denial and disintegration. Early writers recognized the philosophical force of this idea and used artifacts not as mere plot devices, but as symbols of humanity's fragile relationship with truth. A document becomes a doorway. A doorway becomes an abyss. The most iconic example is the fictional grimoire said to circulate in fragments across centuries. It appears not as a complete system of doctrine, but as a set of contradictions, warnings, genealogies, astronomical alignments, and cryptic accounts of pre-human civilizations. The book's power lies in its incompleteness. Each edition contradicts the others, yet all gesture toward a world far older and stranger than recorded history. When characters encounter it, they rarely acquire comprehensive knowledge. Instead, they discover their lack of it. The book operates as a philosophical mirror. It reflects the limits of human explanation by presenting data that refuses synthesis. Artifacts function similarly. A stone with markings that defy linguistic analysis becomes a philosophical puzzle. A preserved specimen that blends botanical and animal features undermines biological classification. A metal that corrodes in reverse time challenges physical law. These objects create cognitive pressure because they do not fit. Not mystery, but incompatibility drives the narrative. These artifacts work through what scholars might call destabilizing evidence, items that imply the existence of a world adjacent to ours, governed by principles we cannot articulate. Their presence forces characters to reevaluate fundamental assumptions about nature, chronology, and identity. Translation is a frequent catalyst for collapse. Characters attempting to decipher symbols or inscriptions often encounter contradictions. A passage might shift meaning depending on context, or its grammar may follow no recognizable structure. The act of translation exposes the interpreter to layers of meaning that appear intentionally obscured. A fictional epigraph, often quoted in analyses, captures the mood. He translated the words, but not the mind behind them. The line clarifies the UEE's philosophical issue. Knowledge is not simply information. It is information structured by a worldview. When the worldview is alien, comprehension becomes a trap. Scientific inquiry deepens rather than resolves these tensions. Researchers who analyze artifacts using geology, chemistry, or anthropology often generate results that contradict each other. A fossil may appear millions of years older than the rock surrounding it. A sample may decay in a pattern inconsistent with known isotopes. These contradictions expose a core theme: methodologies designed for a human-centered world collapse when applied to cosmic-scale phenomena. The problem is not flawed science, but limited premises. Cosmic horror uses this failure to dramatize a disturbing idea. Truth does not adapt to human understanding. Human understanding attempts and fails to adapt to truth. Some stories explore forbidden knowledge through sensory revelation rather than documents. A character may witness a structure unfolding through dimensions they cannot perceive, or hear frequencies that imply vast intelligences moving through non-local space. These revelations create fractures in the character's worldview because they expose the artificial stability of perception. Humans rely on sensory filtering to manage the flood of environmental data. When that filter fails, the mind receives more than it can process. This is why sensory overload frequently precedes madness. Not fear, but excess destabilizes identity. The collapse of epistemology culminates in a moment where characters recognize that their explanatory tools, logic, language, narrative, cannot contain the truth before them. Some flee, others deny, and a few attempt to record what they have learned, despite knowing that their account will appear incoherent. A line from one fictional journal captures the tension. "I write this knowing each word shrinks the truth to fit the page." The statement reveals the philosophical core of forbidden knowledge. The problem is not ignorance, but reduction. The monstrous truth is too large, and the mind must compress it until it fractures. Forbidden knowledge also introduces moral ambiguity. Unlike traditional cautionary tales, cosmic horror does not punish curiosity. Instead, it presents curiosity as an inevitable human impulse that collides with an indifferent universe. The collapse that follows is not retribution, it is consequence. Characters become casualties of epistemic misalignment. Their downfall suggests that truth exists beyond human comprehension, and that seeking it may expose cognitive structures not designed for cosmic-scale information. This perspective distinguishes cosmic horror from earlier traditions of forbidden lore, where knowledge is dangerous because it is sinful. Here, knowledge is dangerous because the universe is vast. These dynamics make forbidden knowledge central to the genre's emotional and philosophical foundation. It transforms reading into participation, because each revelation invites the audience to consider how much their own understanding relies on unspoken assumptions. As we move to the next part, we will examine how these themes manifest in specific stories, tracing the earliest appearances of these ideas and exploring how intertextual connections solidified cosmic horror into a coherent, evolving literary tradition. The earliest appearances of cosmic horror monsters reveal a literary environment still experimenting with scale, language, and narrative structure. These stories did not yet possess a fully developed mythos, yet they carried the essential elements that would later define the genre. Early works approached monstrosity as a philosophical problem rather than a physical threat, using fragments, testimonies, and incomplete observations to convey creatures that resisted depiction. This strategy allowed writers to imply beings larger than the narrative medium could contain. The technique suited the cultural moment, which was already grappling with new scientific revelations that demanded entirely new ways of imagining the universe. One of the foundational texts opens with a mariner encountering a creature rising from the sea. The passage is brief, yet it sets the pattern for later cosmic horror. "I think I saw a shape, though the waves unmade it as soon as it rose." The ambiguity is central. The monster is neither described nor denied. It interrupts the boundary between perception and the unknown. The story structure mirrors this blurring, shifting between diary entries and official reports. These fragments create a sense of accumulated evidence rather than a single definitive encounter. The technique signals that the creature's existence cannot be contained in a single viewpoint. It requires a mosaic of conflicting perspectives. Another early appearance involves a meteorite landing near a rural farm. Instead of introducing a concrete organism, the story focuses on a substance, a color that refuses linguistic classification. This innovation is significant because it circumvents the traditional monster entirely. Instead of a body, readers receive an effect. Vegetation shrivels, animals behave erratically, Water dims in the well. The phenomenon reveals itself through consequences rather than form. This method broadens the concept of monstrosity. It suggests that a creature may not require anatomy. It may exist as a principle or force. The narrative impact is profound. Readers confront something that feels alive, yet lacks any recognizable traits of life. A third early story introduces a hybrid creature born of unnatural union, yet even here the emphasis remains on cognitive tension. Villagers describe it in conflicting terms. Some claim it stands upright, others insist it crawls. The inconsistency is not simply atmospheric. It reflects the instability of perception in the presence of the unfamiliar. The creature functions as a narrative pressure point. Its existence implies a breach in the boundaries separating human and non-human worlds. This breach becomes the central horror, not the creature itself. The text demonstrates an important shift. Monstrosity becomes a sign of structural disruption rather than moral corruption. Intertextual connections among these early works strengthen the sense of a shared world. References to ancient civilizations, forbidden books, and recurring place names create continuity without overt explanation. A mention of a university archive in one story reappears in another as the source of an incomplete translation. A coastal village described in passing becomes the primary setting for a later narrative. These small echoes accumulate, producing the illusion of a coherent underlying history. The strategy resembles archaeological reconstruction. Each story provides a shard. Readers assemble the pot. This collaborative effect distinguishes cosmic horror from earlier genres, which often preferred self-contained narratives. In these early texts, monsters rarely appear in full view. They surface through geometry, sound, or psychological disturbance. Consider a brief example from an early tale. The stones did not align with any compass of man. The line reveals nothing about the creature itself, yet it implies a logic foreign to human structure. By linking the monster to an environment where physical laws seem distorted, the story reframes the creature as an expression of a broader cosmic condition. This approach anticipates later works, where entire cities or landscapes operate as manifestations of alien intelligence. The shift from organism to environment marks a key evolution in the genre's development. Another connective technique involves recurring themes of deep time. Several early stories reference epochs predating humanity, often through fossils or ruins. These references serve a narrative purpose. They relocate monstrosity into the geological record. A creature, glimpsed in the present, becomes the remnant of a civilization that flourished before mammals existed. This use of deep time expands the scale of the horror. It transforms isolated incidents into archaeological evidence of an unrecorded cosmic order. The method prepares readers for later stories where monstrous beings embody the vastness of the planet's forgotten history. Across these early appearances, a pattern becomes clear. The monsters function less as antagonists and more as philosophical provocations. They destabilize categories, life, form, perception, chronology, without revealing a stable identity of their own. Their interactions with humans remain limited, fragmentary, and ambiguous. Yet these fragments accumulate meaning through intertextual reinforcement. As each story adds a new element, a symbol, a location, a linguistic hint, the monsters acquire historical weight. They begin to feel like long-standing forces rather than recent inventions. This foundational period established the narrative and conceptual tools that later writers would refine: fragmented documentation, deep time, unstable perception, and the blurring of natural law. As we move to the next subsection, we will examine a major story that consolidated these ideas into a fully realized form, demonstrating how a single narrative could anchor the emerging mythos while advancing the philosophical core of cosmic horror. The story, often considered the first full consolidation of cosmic horror's principles, uses fragmentation as its central method. Its narrative unfolds through notes, journals, police reports, and a sailor's testimony. This structure does more than organize information. It demonstrates how a monster too large for direct description must be approached indirectly. Each fragment provides a narrow aperture through which readers glimpse a much wider reality. The story's power rests on this accumulation. No single narrator understands the creature. Only the reader receives the mosaic, and even then, it remains incomplete. Consider this carefully, because the structure mirrors the philosophical tension that defines cosmic horror. Truth exists, yet no human mind can hold it whole. One of the most famous scenes involves a dream contagion spreading among sensitive individuals. The text describes images of vast stone towers rising from the sea, and a chant that rolled through sleep like thunder in slow motion. The language conveys intrusion rather than imagination. Dreams become an extension of the creature's influence, suggesting consciousness is not bounded by the skull. This narrative choice reflects broader concerns of the early 20th century, when psychology was re-evaluating the permeability of the mind. Here, dreams reveal the monster before any physical encounter takes place. The entity's first appearance is conceptual, not visual, emphasizing that its danger lies in influence rather than presence. The story's core revelation occurs when a group of sailors encounter a city suddenly risen from the ocean depths. The architecture becomes the first concrete sign of monstrosity. Passages describe doorways at impossible angles and streets that seem to bend in contradictory directions. The narrator notes, "No geometry of ours could account for the lines we saw." This sentence encapsulates the key innovation. The monster manifests through physics rather than biology. The city serves as the creature's intermediary form, a structure built according to principles incompatible with human perception. The narrative does not require detailed anatomy because the environment conveys the necessary conceptual shock. When the creature finally appears, the description remains deliberately unstable. The narrator writes that the being slid and towered simultaneously, suggesting movement that defies consistent perspective. Readers receive impressions rather than measurements. The story avoids clarifying whether the creature's shifting form reflects actual physical instability or the mind's failure to interpret it. This ambiguity is essential. It turns the encounter into a test of human cognition. The sailor's famous escape, not victory, illustrates the genre's difference from heroic narrative. Survival occurs through accident, not resistance. The creature remains unharmed, unchanged, and barely aware of human presence. The story also uses global interconnectedness to reinforce the creature's scale. Cult fragments from Louisiana, the Pacific Islands, and Arctic explorers all reference the same being. These groups possess only partial understanding, yet their myths converge. The effect is cumulative. The monster appears not as a local threat, but as a planetary phenomenon. Intertextual echoes across cultures imply that humanity has been brushing against the creature's influence for centuries without comprehending it. This narrative strategy expands the story's emotional weight. It transforms isolated fear into civilizational insignificance. The most quoted line from the story appears near its conclusion. The world is indeed full of strange survivals, and perhaps it is for the best that we are kept ignorant. This sentence provides a retrospective frame for the entire narrative. It suggests that ignorance is not failure, but protection. The narrator's decision to document the events, despite his fear, introduces another philosophical tension: the urge to record truth even when truth harms. The line resonates because it reframes horror not as a discrete event, but as a persistent condition, one that emerges whenever knowledge expands faster than the structures designed to contain it. Narratively, the creature functions as an anchor for the emerging mythos. It demonstrates how cosmic horror combines deep time, unstable perception, and epistemic collapse into a unified form. The creature is ancient, yet dormant, immense, yet indifferent, present, yet largely inaccessible. These contradictions do not weaken the narrative, they define it. The story offers a template for later writers. Introduce a being through fragments, reveal it through environment, and allow its presence to destabilize the interpretive structures of the characters. By refusing closure, the story preserves the creature's mystery. Even after its brief awakening, the world returns to silence, not resolution. This case study shows how one narrative crystallized the ideas that earlier stories only hinted at. It refined the balance between suggestion and revelation, using narrative gaps to maintain intellectual unease. As we move into the next subsection, we will examine another major story that expanded the genre in a different direction, one where the monster appears not through architecture or dreams, but through a phenomenon that challenges the limits of perception itself. The second major case study shifts cosmic horror away from monumental architecture and toward something far more intimate: perception itself. The monster in this narrative has no stable form. It exists as a phenomenon, a color outside the visible spectrum that infiltrates a rural landscape. This choice marks an important evolution. Instead of confronting readers with scale, the story confronts them with sensory inadequacy. The early cosmic texts often positioned humans as small in space. This one positions them as limited in perception. The shift expands the genre by demonstrating that terror emerges not only from cosmic vastness, but from epistemic boundaries embedded in biology. The narrative begins with the apparent fall of a meteor, described as a globule of metal softer than any known ore, which evaporates under examination. This disappearance establishes the story's central dynamic. The monster withdraws from analysis. Scientists arrive, test the remains, record anomalies, yet each experiment increases confusion. One character notes that the residue glowed, even in shade, though with no tint I could name. This detail matters because it is the first time cosmic horror explicitly uses linguistic failure as a defining characteristic of monstrosity. The monster does not reveal itself by overwhelming the senses. It reveals itself by exceeding them. As the phenomenon spreads, the story uses environmental decay to illustrate the breakdown of natural law. Vegetation grows unnaturally large, then collapses into ash. Animals avoid water that has become strangely luminescent. The domestic sphere, the farm, the orchard, the well, transforms from familiar to hostile. This setting choice is deliberate. By placing cosmic intrusion in a rural environment associated with stability, the narrative heightens tension between the ordinary and the incomprehensible. Not invasion, but corruption becomes the operative pattern. The phenomenon assimilates the landscape, revealing that even seemingly solid environments depend on fragile chemical balances. The most devastating scenes involve the family living on the affected land. Their slow decline illustrates how monstrous presence fractures human identity. Each family member reacts differently. The mother becomes withdrawn, staring at the glowing barn. The father attempts rational interpretation despite mounting evidence. The youngest child speaks of colors in the night that move without source. The story rarely attributes intent to the phenomenon. Instead, it emphasizes the family's cognitive struggle. A particularly striking passage describes the mother's breakdown. Her words trailed off into sounds that suggested speech, yet carried no meaning. The monster's influence appears not as violence, but as linguistic erosion, aligning perfectly with the genre's broader themes. A crucial narrative moment occurs when the well becomes the central point of corruption. Animals avoid it, vegetation withers around it, and faint glimmers rise from its depths. The well functions as a symbolic aperture, an opening between the familiar and the cosmically strange. When one of the children disappears near it, the narrative avoids any graphic depiction. Instead, it presents the father's failed attempt to articulate what he saw. There was movement, yes, but not of any living thing. This line encapsulates the story's method. It uses incomplete observation to imply the presence of something that defies biological categories without ever revealing its structure. The story's climax arrives when the color withdraws into the sky, leaving behind devastation. The explosion of light is described as a final uncoiling, like a creature shaking free of Earth's narrowness. Yet the text refuses to confirm that the phenomenon is alive. The ambiguity is central. If the color is a life form, its movement suggests escape. If it is a force, its departure suggests dissipation. In either interpretation, humanity plays no meaningful role. The characters do not repel the monster, they survive its passing. The universe remains indifferent, and the phenomenon resumes whatever cycle it followed long before landing on the farm. Intertextually, this story expands the mythos by demonstrating that monstrosity can exist without moral, psychological, or biological traits. It positions the monster as pure incompatibility. This development influences later cosmic horror by shifting emphasis from creature design to experiential disruption. The phenomenon's lack of form encourages readers to consider how many aspects of the universe might lie outside human perceptual bandwidth. It also reinforces the genre's fascination with failed interpretation. Every attempt to study the color, scientific, domestic, or narrative, results in contradiction. This technique links the story to the philosophical concerns of the larger mythos, the collapse of explanatory systems under the pressure of the unknown. The narrative ends not with closure, but with warning. The land remains tainted, and the narrator speculates that the phenomenon may return. Unlike earlier cosmic monsters that slumber beneath oceans or wait in hidden temples, this one leaves behind an environmental residue rather than a mythic lineage. Its legacy is chemical, not theological. This difference broadens the genre's reach. It implies that cosmic threat can emerge from natural processes rather than ancient gods, making the boundary between scientific discovery and existential danger disturbingly thin. This case study therefore represents a turning point. It demonstrates how cosmic horror can be profound without relying on colossal beings or sacred relics. Instead, it uses perceptual limits and environmental collapse to articulate the same philosophical tensions: insignificance, incomprehension, and the instability of reality. As we move to the next subsection, we will examine how later authors expanded these innovations, constructing shared mythologies while simultaneously reshaping the philosophical priorities of the genre. Later writers expanded the foundations of cosmic horror, not by repeating earlier ideas, but by testing the limits of the form. Their contributions reveal how the genre evolved once its core principles, deep time, epistemic instability, and indifferent monstrosity, were established. These authors inherited fragments rather than a unified system, and they responded by developing new structures of fear. The result is a body of work that simultaneously reinforces and challenges the original vision. Consider this carefully, because these expansions shaped how cosmic horror was interpreted across the 20th century and into contemporary media. August Derleth introduced the first major reinterpretation. His approach attempted to systematize the earlier mythos, aligning cosmic entities with elemental categories. Fire, air, water, and earth became convenient symbols used to assign roles, hierarchies, and oppositions. This framework altered the philosophical tone. Where earlier stories emphasized randomness and indifference, Derleth emphasized conflict and moral structure. His creatures behaved more like deities in struggle than like forces beyond good and evil. Scholars often point to this shift as a clarifying example of the tension between myth-making and myth-codifying. Not expansion, but reconfiguration describes Derleth's influence. He turned existential terror into something closer to cosmic theology. Clark Ashton Smith offered a different kind of expansion. Instead of structuring the mythos, he enriched it through imaginative geography. His stories take place in far future continents, lost empires, and dying worlds. In these settings, cosmic beings appear not as intrusions, but as natural inhabitants of an aging universe. Smith's language, ornate, meticulous, and deliberately archaic, creates an atmosphere where decay feels inevitable. A representative passage describes a being older than the Iwisi, Earth's first cooling, slumbering in the copper dusk of a continent without future. This style shifts the emotional register. Horror emerges through the inevitability of decline rather than confrontation with the unknown. Smith's contribution expanded the aesthetics of cosmic horror, demonstrating that tone can transform the philosophical impact of the same underlying concepts. Robert E. Howard's interaction with cosmic elements demonstrates another narrative direction. Howard's protagonists confront cosmic beings through physical courage rather than scholarly investigation, yet the encounter almost always reveals limits rather than triumph. In one tale, a warrior approaches a monolithic entity whose surface pulsed like stone remembering heat. Howard blends mythos elements with heroic structure, but refuses to allow heroism to solve the underlying problem. His characters may survive, but they acquire no lasting understanding. Howard's innovation lies in juxtaposition. By placing cosmic threat in an action-oriented setting, he highlights its incompatibility with conventional narrative expectations. The monster remains ultimately immune to combat, preserving the genre's core principle of human limitation. Ramsey Campbell brought the mythos into contemporary British settings, extracting horror from familiar towns and landscapes. His early stories reinterpret earlier creatures through modern anxieties, urban isolation, linguistic fragmentation, and psychological vulnerability. Campbell's innovation lies in his attention to local detail. He replaces remote temples and ancient ruins with decaying libraries, industrial outskirts, and neglected neighborhoods. These environments make the cosmic intrusion feel disturbingly accessible. A character in one of his stories remarks, "The street seemed arranged to confuse, as if remembering a geometry the town no longer obeyed." This line demonstrates Campbell's method. cosmic distortion, expressed through human environments that betray subtle shifts in structure. Thomas Ligotti represents perhaps the most radical philosophical expansion. His stories rarely rely on specific monsters. Instead, they depict consciousness itself as a site of horror. Ligotti reframes cosmic dread through pessimism, arguing that human life is a malign accident sustained by delusion. In his narrative worlds, entities appear less as intruders and more as metaphors for the emptiness underlying reality. An often cited line from one of his characters laments, "We are the dreams of something that does not sleep." Ligotti's contribution matters because it pushes cosmic horror toward pure philosophy. He removes myth entirely and retains only the intellectual consequences. The result is a version of cosmic horror stripped to its conceptual essence. Later expansions in games and collaborative media further diversified the form. Tabletop role-playing systems emphasized investigation, uncertainty, and mental strain. These adaptations established madness mechanics, procedural mystery structures, and collaborative world-building frameworks. Their influence fed back into literature, encouraging more modular and multi-perspective narratives. The genre thus became recursive. Readers and players contributed to the mythos, blurring the boundary between audience and creator. This evolution mirrors the original fragmentation of early texts, yet now distributed across entire communities. Taken together, these expansions demonstrate that cosmic horror thrives not when authors agree, but when they reinterpret the genre's central tensions, meaninglessness, instability, and cognitive fracture, through new cultural lenses. Derleth imposed structure, Smith expanded atmosphere, Howard tested heroic forms, Campbell modernized landscape, Ligotti distilled philosophy. Each contribution altered the emotional texture while preserving the recognition that humanity occupies a precarious position within a universe that does not answer to its expectations. As we move into the next part, we will see how these literary developments influenced broader culture, shaping myths, hoaxes, adaptations, and academic discourse, and revealing how cosmic horror's afterlife extends far beyond the page. Modern myths and hoaxes surrounding cosmic horror monsters reveal something striking about contemporary culture. People continue to treat fictional entities as if they occupy an ambiguous zone between imagination and possibility. This tendency emerged not because audiences believe in literal monsters, but because the genre's themes, deep time, hidden history, and epistemic instability, mirror real uncertainties in the modern world. As scientific knowledge expands, so too does the space for speculation. Cosmic horror thrives in that space, providing symbols flexible enough to inhabit online folklore, urban legends, and collaborative storytelling. One of the earliest hoaxes involved a supposed complete edition of a forbidden grimoire circulating in the 1970s. The book appeared in specialty shops with no clear publisher, advertised as a newly discovered translation of an ancient text. Its contents blended astronomical charts, invented alphabets, and vague prophecies. The hoax succeeded because it replicated the textual ambiguity central to cosmic horror, incomplete information masquerading as revelation. Readers treated the book less as a literal artifact and more as a conceptual challenge. They debated its origins, discussed its inconsistencies, and speculated about its unknown compiler. The conversation mattered more than the object itself, illustrating how the genre inspires participation rather than passive consumption. Urban legends built on similar impulses, stories circulated about coastal sightings, massive shadows beneath fishing boats, strange lights rising from storm-torn waters, abandoned shipping vessels found with logs describing voices from below. These tales rarely offered concrete detail. Instead, they echoed the narrative strategies of early cosmic texts, partial accounts, uncertain witnesses, and events that resist investigation. Internet forums amplified these stories, transforming them into shared mythologies through repeated retellings. The legends acquired localized identities: Pacific versions, Atlantic versions, Arctic versions, reinforcing the idea that cosmic presence adapts to geography. The process mirrors folkloric evolution, but operates far more quickly due to digital circulation. A notable modern development is the blending of cosmic horror elements with real-world scientific anomalies. Deep-sea recordings such as the 1997 Bloop became cultural touchstones not because of their acoustic signatures, but because audiences framed them within narratives of submerged ancient entities. The original scientific explanation, icequakes, did little to diminish the mythic resonance. Listeners preferred to imagine a vast organism exerting pressure on the ocean floor. This reaction demonstrates how cosmic horror shapes interpretation. Ambiguous data becomes a canvas for speculation. The unknown transforms automatically into the cosmic, even when mundane explanations exist. Hoaxes extend beyond text and audio. Visual fabrications, photographs of unusual fossils, satellite images showing non-Euclidean land formations, or doctored deep-sea footage circulate widely. These images often include minimal context, allowing viewers to impose their own narratives. One infamous image depicts a structure resembling a massive stone arch deep underwater, accompanied by the caption, "Geological survey terminated due to equipment failure." Whether believed or not, the image engages viewers by inviting them to imagine what lies outside human exploration. Such hoaxes succeed because cosmic horror conditions audiences to treat incompleteness as meaningful rather than frustrating. Online culture has accelerated these dynamics. Platforms dedicated to collaborative fiction treat cosmic horror entities as shared intellectual property. Users create regional variants, historical timelines, and speculative scientific papers. Though clearly fictional, these communities blur the line between myth and analysis. Participants adopt the tone of researchers, using invented terminology and mock academic footnotes. The phenomenon reflects the genre's original strategy of using scholarly language to evoke authenticity. Not sincerity, but structure fuels the effect. By speaking in the voice of academia, contributors transform play into something that feels like collective world-building grounded in intellectual inquiry. Interestingly, some of the most persistent sightings involve experiences rather than creatures. People report moments of spatial distortion, unusual atmospheric vibrations, or feelings of immensity that arrive without visible cause. These accounts circulate as cosmic anomalies. They rarely mention specific entities. Instead, they echo the philosophical themes of the genre, the instability of perception, and the suspicion that reality contains layers not normally accessible. These stories persist because they turn subjective phenomena, sleep paralysis, sensory fatigue, acoustic resonance, into glimpses of a larger, hidden structure. They reveal how cosmic horror provides a framework for interpreting ambiguous experiences without requiring literal belief. What unites these myths, hoaxes, and sightings is their reliance on uncertainty. Each example uses gaps, missing evidence, incomplete testimony, unexplained signals, not as weaknesses, but as sources of meaning. the unknown becomes an active participant, shaping the narrative through absence. This mirrors the genre's fundamental logic. Cosmic horror operates by positioning humans at the edge of comprehension. Modern folklore adopts the same stance, suggesting that some truths remain out of reach not because they are hidden, but because human cognition cannot encompass them. These contemporary narratives demonstrate that cosmic horror persists because it adapts to cultural needs. It offers symbols for confronting scientific ambiguity, digital misinformation, and the expanding boundaries of knowledge. Not answers, but frameworks become its legacy. As we move to the next subsection, we will examine how these ideas migrate into film, games, and music. Media that transform cosmic horror's intellectual unease into visual, auditory, and interactive forms. Adaptations of cosmic horror in modern media reveal how different artistic forms attempt to express ideas fundamentally resistant to representation. Each medium, film, games, and music, confronts the same challenge. How do you depict the undepictable? The resulting works vary widely, yet they share a common strategy. Instead of trying to show cosmic monsters directly, they translate the genre's philosophical core, insignificance, instability, and cognitive fracture into sensory experiences. Audiences do not witness the monster, they witness its consequences. This shift allows the themes to survive even when the form changes. Film adaptations often approach cosmic horror indirectly. Rather than presenting entities in full view, directors emphasize atmosphere, fragmented testimony, or visual distortion. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, remains a central example because it uses assimilation rather than scale to undermine identity. The creature never reveals its true form. It mimics, replaces, and imitates. A memorable line, "I know I'm me, who are you?" captures the central tension. Here, monstrosity arises through epistemic uncertainty. Viewers experience the dread of not knowing which perceptions remain trustworthy. This method aligns closely with early textual strategies, proving that the genre adapts not by copying scenes, but by preserving conceptual disruption. Other films apply cosmic horror to ecological or psychological themes. Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, depicts an expanding zone where biology mutates according to unfamiliar rules. The film avoids explicit explanations, using visual anomalies, refracted landscapes, hybrid creatures, self-duplicating figures, to evoke a presence that refuses classification. The lighthouse sequence, where light fractures into impossible geometries, echoes the literary tradition in which spatial distortion signals contact with alien intelligence. The film succeeds not through spectacle, but through implication. Its final gesture, a shimmer reflected in a character's eyes, remains ambiguous, resisting closure. Interactive media, especially video games, offer unique possibilities because they place players inside unstable environments. Titles like Bloodborne reinterpret cosmic horror through action-oriented gameplay while retaining philosophical depth. The player begins in a world of gothic beasts, only to discover that these creatures are symptoms of celestial influence. As the narrative unfolds, insight, represented as a literal game mechanic, changes what the player sees. A creature invisible at the beginning becomes visible later, not because it appears, but because perception expands. This approach captures a key theme of cosmic horror. Knowledge alters the conditions of experience. Other games focus on investigative structures. Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth, 2005, blends stealth, exploration, and psychological deterioration. The protagonist's sanity declines in response to visual anomalies and forbidden texts, demonstrating how interaction with cosmic forces reshapes cognition. Notably, the game implements a mechanic where the player loses control during moments of extreme terror. This mirrors the genre's broader theme. The mind resists truths it cannot integrate. By embedding that resistance into gameplay, developers turn philosophical tension into mechanical consequence. Tabletop games represent another significant expansion. Call of Cthulhu, 1981, introduced systemic madness, shifting role-playing away from heroic progression toward investigative fragility. Characters grow more informed yet more vulnerable, reflecting the narrative arc of many cosmic horror stories. The rule set reinforces the genre's central paradox. Learning more increases danger. Collaborative play also mimics the fragmented testimony found in early literature. Each player uncovers partial truths, but only the group constructs the broader picture, often too late to prevent collapse. Music, though non-narrative, contributes its own adaptations. Metal and dark ambient genres use dissonance, layered drones, and rhythmic irregularity to evoke the feeling of vast, indifferent structures. Bands inspired by cosmic horror often avoid lyrics that describe monsters directly. Instead, they employ phrases referencing deep time, astronomical scale, or dissolution. The music operates as affect rather than story, conveying the genre's emotional core, awe fused with dread. Some compositions incorporate spoken fragments from fictional texts, using distorted recitations to imitate the instability of forbidden knowledge. In these contexts, sound becomes a symbolic proxy for contact with the incomprehensible. Visual art also plays a crucial role in these adaptations. Illustrators frequently depict cosmic entities not as bodies, but as distortions, fractured silhouettes, impossible angles, or forms dissolving into light. This approach avoids the trap of overdefinition. The viewer encounters something incomplete and must supply meaning. This method parallels the narrative strategy of early texts, which relied on implication rather than explicit detail. By emphasizing what cannot be fully rendered, artists preserve the philosophical weight of cosmic horror while adapting it to a visual medium. Across film, games, music, and art, the persistence of cosmic horror reflects a larger cultural need. These adaptations resonate because they address anxieties about scientific expansion, technological acceleration, and the vastness of contemporary knowledge. Modern audiences confront a world filled with data yet lacking certainty. Cosmic horror externalizes that condition. It presents a universe where human understanding fails not through error, but through limitation. Not hopelessness, but humility becomes the central note. As we move to the next subsection, we will examine how these themes migrate beyond entertainment into subcultures and academic discourse, revealing how cosmic horror has become a framework for thinking about culture, philosophy, and the fragility of human meaning itself. Cosmic horror's migration into subcultures and academic spaces demonstrates how the genre has outgrown its literary origins. Its ideas now function as analytical tools, aesthetic frameworks, and philosophical provocations. Subcultures adopt its symbols to express alienation. Academic fields employ its structures to question certainty. Online communities treat its concepts as shared intellectual playgrounds. These adaptations matter because they reveal what cosmic horror has become. Not merely a set of stories, but a cultural language for describing anxiety in an age defined by overwhelming complexity. The genre's influence appears most visibly in alternative subcultures. Gothic, dark ambient, and post-industrial communities often integrate cosmic motifs into fashion, visual art, and performance. These groups employ symbols, spirals, distorted geometries, runic fragments, not because they literalize monstrous presence, but because these images articulate feelings of estrangement. A jacket embroidered with angular sigils communicates a quiet refusal of coherence, a visual shorthand for the belief that the world contains layers of meaning beyond comprehension. This use of aesthetics reflects the genre's intellectual core, the recognition that human frameworks remain provisional. Online spaces have amplified these subcultural dynamics. Forums dedicated to liminal experiences, anomalous dreams, and speculative cosmology regularly incorporate cosmic horror's vocabulary. Participants share accounts of geometry that didn't hold, time that folded, or shapes that felt too large to inhabit the room. Most contributors understand these descriptions metaphorically, using them to discuss psychological states, dissociation, sleep paralysis, memory instability. Cosmic horror becomes a language for expressing experiences that resist conventional articulation. Not pathology, but metaphor drives these conversations. They reveal how deeply the genre's themes resonate with individuals navigating modern life's mental and sensory instability. Academic engagement emerged more slowly, but now constitutes a substantial body of scholarship. Literary theorists analyze narrative, strategies, fragmentation, unreliable testimony, non-Euclidean description to understand how fiction conveys epistemic breakdown. Philosophers examine the genre's confrontation with nihilism, often comparing cosmic horror to existentialist thought. A recurring academic question asks whether these narratives depict an indifferent universe, or whether they simply dramatize the limits of human cognition. The distinction matters because it shapes how scholars interpret the genre's emotional effect: despair, humility, or ambiguous wonder. This scholarly debate shows that cosmic horror invites questions rather than answers. Anthropologists and cultural theorists have also incorporated cosmic horror as an analytical tool. Some examine how societies respond to uncertainties, ecological change, technological acceleration, global risk, by adopting narratives of unseen forces. These analyses rarely treat cosmic entities literally. Instead, they use the genre to explore how communities construct meaning under conditions of instability. A frequently cited triad, environmental unpredictability, informational overload, and existential precarity, mirrors the narrative pressures found in cosmic horror stories. The academic adoption signals that the genre expresses something more universal than its fictional trappings. Fan communities participate in these developments by creating collaborative mythologies. Unlike traditional fandoms that focus on character arcs or plot continuity, cosmic horror communities emphasize speculation. Users develop timelines, reinterpret entities, and invent new philosophical consequences. The appeal lies in open-endedness. Because cosmic horror rejects definitive cosmology, fans treat the mythos as an evolving puzzle rather than a canonical universe. This collaborative ambiguity echoes earlier literary techniques, fragments, contradictions, and incomplete texts, but now operates across thousands of contributors. The result is a decentralized, ever-changing archive of cosmic speculation. Some subcultures engage the genre through ritualized creativity. Writers hold void writing sessions, where participants attempt to describe impossible sensations without relying on standard language. Visual artists design glyphs that imitate the suggestion of ancient or alien systems. Musicians record drone compositions meant to evoke structures too vast for articulation. These practices do not attempt to summon or recreate monsters. They explore what it means to express ideas that exceed expression. In this sense, subcultures replicate the philosophical impulses of early cosmic horror authors, though through experimental art rather than written narrative. Academic institutions have also embraced the genre through courses, conferences, and interdisciplinary seminars. These events often frame cosmic horror as a lens for discussing media theory, philosophy of science, and environmental studies. One seminar described the genre as the literature of the Anthropocene's unconscious, arguing that its themes, entropy, scale, temporal instability, mirror real anxieties about planetary change. This interpretation extends cosmic horror far beyond its fictional roots, suggesting that the genre functions as cultural theory disguised as narrative. Such perspectives further legitimize cosmic horror as a tool for interpreting contemporary crises. Together, these subcultural and academic appropriations demonstrate that cosmic horror persists because it offers a flexible framework for grappling with modern uncertainty. It provides language for experiences that feel too large, too ambiguous, or too destabilizing for traditional categories. Not escape, but articulation becomes its purpose. As we move to the final subsection, we will explore how these cultural uses reveal deeper psychological and philosophical implications. Implications that continue to shape how audiences understand themselves in a universe that remains silent, vast, and fundamentally unmoved. Cosmic horror endures because its implications extend beyond literature. It speaks to a fundamental tension in human life, the desire for meaning in a universe that offers no guarantees. Modern audiences encounter this tension daily through scientific discoveries that expand the cosmos, technologies that outpace understanding, and ecological shifts that destabilize familiar rhythms. Cosmic horror provides a conceptual framework for interpreting these conditions. Its monsters reflect not external threats, but internal realizations, the recognition that human significance is neither assured nor necessary. This recognition unsettles, yet clarifies, creating a paradoxical appeal that sustains the genre's influence. One psychological implication involves the confrontation with scale. Astronomical data, especially after the Hubble Deep Field images of 1995, revealed galaxies numbering in the thousands within a tiny patch of sky. Its observations transformed abstract speculation into visual fact. Cosmic horror anticipated this shift by encouraging readers to imagine themselves against a background too vast for personal narratives to encompass. The genre therefore aligns with contemporary experiences of smallness. People find themselves navigating systems, global, digital, ecological, that feel indifferent to individual action. The monsters stand in for these systems, giving shape to anxieties that resist direct articulation. Another persistent implication concerns the instability of perception. Modern psychology acknowledges that the mind filters, edits, and constructs reality rather than simply recording it. Cosmic horror dramatizes this process by placing characters in situations where their perceptual frameworks fail. Readers recognize the metaphor even when couched in supernatural terms. The stories suggest that the mind is both a tool and a barrier. When the tool breaks, the world becomes unrecognizable. This insight resonates in an age of information overload, where conflicting narratives, visual distortions, and algorithmic mediation challenge the reliability of experience. The genre's emphasis on epistemic fragility therefore reflects a broader cultural condition. Philosophically, cosmic horror raises questions about agency. Characters rarely defeat cosmic entities. They witness, endure, or escape by coincidence. This structure undermines heroic models that dominate much of popular storytelling. It proposes a universe where human will encounter limits long before it encounters victory. Such narratives resonate with audiences facing large-scale problems: climate change, economic instability, technological acceleration, that cannot be resolved by individual effort. Not resignation, but recognition becomes the emotional outcome. The genre invites reflection on what agency means when operating within structures too large to influence. Cosmic horror also intersects with, though, contemporary discussions about the Anthropocene. As environmental systems shift, the planet itself begins to feel unfamiliar. Landscapes transform, species vanish, and weather patterns destabilize, generating a sense of uncanny estrangement. Readers increasingly interpret cosmic horror not as fantasy, but as metaphor for ecological precarity. When characters observe corrupted ecosystems or inexplicable natural phenomena, the stories echo real anxieties about a world changing beyond human control. This alignment gives cosmic horror renewed relevance. It provides a symbolic vocabulary for describing the emotional impact of environmental change: dread, awe, confusion, and humility. The genre's implications extend into existential philosophy. Many stories imply that meaning arises from human perception rather than universal design. This position parallels arguments from thinkers such as Camus and Sartre, who described existence as fundamentally indifferent. Cosmic horror intensifies the argument by introducing beings whose existence dwarfs human meaning-making entirely. Their presence underscores the fragility of human narratives. Yet this fragility does not necessarily produce despair. Some readers find comfort in the acknowledgement that meaning is constructed rather than imposed. The genre therefore supports multiple interpretations: nihilism, humility, existential clarity, or even quiet resilience. Culturally, cosmic horror encourages a shift from certainty to inquiry. Its narratives resist definitive explanations, reminding audiences that ambiguity is not failure, but condition. This perspective contrasts sharply with modern tendencies to demand answers: scientific, political, personal, even when answers remain incomplete. Cosmic horror suggests that unanswered questions can be intellectually productive. They reveal the scale of what remains unknown. This open-endedness fuels both academic discourse and subcultural creativity. It keeps the genre from becoming static, allowing each generation to reinterpret its themes according to contemporary concerns. The final implication involves the boundary between wonder and fear. Cosmic horror operates at their intersection. Its monsters disturb because they embody truths too large for comfort, yet they fascinate because they expand the imaginative horizon. Readers experience a form of conceptual awe, the recognition that existence may contain structures, forces, or histories beyond human comprehension. This awe persists even after the story ends. It lingers as a subtle shift in worldview, a sense that the familiar world may conceal deeper strata of time, meaning, or indifference. The genre's endurance depends on this lingering effect. Cosmic horror ultimately leaves audiences with a single, unresolved possibility: that the universe is neither hostile nor benevolent, but profoundly independent of human expectation. Whether this realization terrifies or illuminates remains a personal question, and each reader must answer alone. The documentary ends here, but the implications do not. They continue to echo, inviting reflection long after the final page closes, suggesting that the true monster is not the creature beyond the stars, but the idea that our understanding has always been smaller than we believed.